You know how every family has that one strange ritual that feels normal when you grow up with it, but the moment you describe it to outsiders, their eyes widen like you just confessed to something illegal? That's exactly where my story begins. And trust me, it's not an exaggeration. When I was a kid, I thought our family's tradition was just a quirky bonding activity, something that made us different in a fun, memorable way, the kind of thing you'd brag about in school just to stand out. But I quickly learned that if I told the wrong person, even casually, there would be this dead silence, followed by a nervous laugh, followed by someone saying, "Wait, you're joking, right?" And the thing is, I wasn't. What we did every year without fail could have actually landed us in serious trouble if the authorities had ever found out. Yet to us, it was so normal, so ingrained in our lives, that we didn't even think twice. The memory of it sticks with me because it wasn't some hidden, shadowy thing done behind locked doors. No, we celebrated it out in the open, right in the middle of our small town, under the bright sun, and no one stopped us. The way it started was almost innocent. My grandfather, a stubborn man with a mischievous sense of humor, believed that children learned best when life was mixed with a touch of daring, even if it crossed a line or two. He had grown up in an era where rules were bendable, where doing something wrong was only wrong if you got caught, and he passed that mentality down to his kids and then to us. Every summer, when the heat made the air thick and the boredom of small-town life settled in, my grandfather would gather us in the living room and declare, "It's time for the ritual." The first time I heard it, I was maybe 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, with my cousins lined up like soldiers waiting for an order. None of us knew what to expect, but the way the adults leaned in, grinning like they were all in on some delicious secret, made my stomach twist with excitement. I thought it would be a game, maybe a scavenger hunt, or a silly performance. I didn't realize then that what we were about to do would not only shape our childhood, but also blur the line between tradition and crime. The ritual wasn't about chanting or lighting candles or anything spiritual. It was about breaking rules, very specific ones, and doing it together as a family. Imagine being taught that stealing wasn't just okay, but a bonding experience, or that trespassing wasn't a crime, but an adventure. We weren't rebels, not in the traditional sense. We were kids following the lead of adults we trusted, believing this was just how families built memories. And honestly, the thrill of it was addictive. I can still hear my heart pounding that first summer night as my grandfather handed us our tools and explained the rules in a whisper, as if he was initiating us into some ancient brotherhood. He made us believe it was our legacy, something passed down for generations, something that made us special. And we believed him. Until the day I realized how close we came to being caught, how one wrong step could have changed everything. That night after my grandfather's announcement, the air was charged with a kind of electricity that made even the simplest things feel dangerous, like the way he dimmed the lights and leaned over the old wooden table where he spread out what looked like a map. To us kids, it was thrilling, like we were being let in on a secret only adults were supposed to know. He didn't explain it like a teacher would. He whispered it like a conspirator, making us feel like little outlaws preparing for a grand heist. The map, which I later realized wasn't a real map at all, but a series of notes he'd scribbled on scraps of paper, outlined locations around town, places where, according to him, things didn't belong to anyone. At least, that's how he phrased it. My 6-year-old brain thought it meant we were about to go treasure hunting, but my older cousin, who was 12, and already understood that the world wasn't as innocent as Grandpa made it sound, looked uneasy. Still, none of us dared to question him. When adults you love and trust tell you something is tradition, you swallow it whole. Grandpa gave each of us a role, like characters in a story. Some were lookouts, others were gatherers, and 1 or 2 of the older kids were carriers, tasked with hauling away the loot. Loot? It sounded like such a fun word back then, like we were pirates. But looking back, the reality was far different. Our ritual was simple, yet shocking. Every summer, we as a family would sneak into abandoned properties, old storage yards, or neglected back alleys and take things. Not valuable jewelry or money. Oh no, Grandpa had rules. We weren't thieves, at least not in his mind. We were collectors of forgotten things, salvagers of what the world had discarded. Except the truth is, a lot of those things weren't abandoned at all. They were broken tools left behind in someone's shed, half-used cans of paint stacked outside a workshop, or crates that clearly belonged to local vendors. To us, it felt like a game, a scavenger hunt that ended with piles of objects no kid had any real use for: rusty wrenches, cracked buckets, dented bicycles. But to my grandfather, this was legacy. He'd grown up during lean times when nothing went to waste, and he spun stories about how his own father had taken him on the same kinds of adventures, sneaking into rail yards or slipping into locked barns to borrow equipment that mysteriously never found its way back. Listening to him, it sounded noble, almost romantic. He framed it as survival, as tradition, as a connection to our past. And so, every summer, we did it. Imagine a pack of children, their small footsteps echoing in the night, eyes wide and hearts racing as parents and uncles and aunts ushered us silently into places that weren't ours. The thrill was intoxicating, half fear, half exhilaration. Every snapped twig sounded like a siren. Every flicker of light made us duck into shadows. Every dog barking in the distance felt like a warning. But then, when we'd succeed, when we carried something home and set it down in the garage like trophies, the rush of pride was enormous. Grandpa would pat us on the head, smile his crooked grin, and say, "That's how it's done. That's family." And the adults would laugh, clap each other on the back, and pour themselves drinks as if we'd accomplished something monumental. I didn't realize until years later that what we were doing wasn't just quirky. It was trespassing, stealing, and teaching children to normalize breaking the law. It wasn't ritual, it was crime dressed up in nostalgia. And the craziest part? Nobody in town ever seemed to notice, or if they did, they never said anything. Maybe they thought we were harmless. Maybe they were too polite to call us out. Or maybe, and this thought still chills me, maybe they all had their own rituals they were hiding too. Because in a small town, secrets are the only real currency, and everyone knows better than to spend them recklessly. As the years passed, the ritual became less of a game and more of an expectation, a seasonal marker the same way other families celebrated birthdays or holidays. The first warm nights of summer weren't just about fireflies and barbecues for us. They were the signal that soon, Grandpa would dust off his maps and gather us like soldiers reporting for duty. By then, I was old enough to understand the difference between a harmless prank and an actual crime, but that didn't stop me from feeling the same wild surge of adrenaline every time we stepped out into the darkness, clutching flashlights with the beams covered by our palms to keep from being seen. My cousins and I whispered to each other about how brave we were, how we were carrying on something ancient, how the rest of the world just wouldn't get it. And truthfully, we were right about that last part. If the police had ever stopped us and asked why a family of nearly 20 people, grandparents, parents, and kids alike, were sneaking into locked yards and shuttered warehouses, no amount of family tradition would have kept us out of trouble. But here's the thing about rituals. When you grow up inside them, you stop questioning. You don't ask if it's right or wrong, you just do it, because tradition has a way of sanctifying even the strangest behaviors. It's like the rhythm of a chant. You don't need to understand the words, you just follow along. And Grandpa was the conductor of it all. He'd puff out his chest, his gravelly voice cutting through the night as he reminded us of the rules. Rule 1, never take anything that someone is actively using. Rule 2, never speak of it to outsiders. Rule 3, if anyone asked, we were just cleaning up what others left behind. These rules felt comforting at the time, like guidelines, that made our ritual safe and justified. But deep down, I knew they were flimsy, excuses dressed up as principles. Still, we obeyed, because defying Grandpa wasn't an option. He had this aura about him, part intimidating, part magnetic. When he spoke, you listened, not out of fear exactly, but out of a kind of inherited loyalty that made you want to please him. And so, we stole. Year after year, summer after summer, we stole. The loot changed with time. Sometimes it was crates of soda bottles stacked outside the back of a convenience store. Sometimes it was construction tools left in the open. Sometimes even bags of grain or firewood piled neatly behind a barn. To us kids, it was all treasure, glowing with the thrill of the forbidden. But to the adults, I think it was more about proving something, that they were still rebels, still capable of bending the world to their will, still carrying the spirit of Grandpa's youth. Looking back, I wonder if they realized how dangerous it all was. There were nights when we came close to getting caught, like the time a dog barked so loudly it woke up half the block, forcing us to scatter into ditches and hide under thorn bushes until our skin bled. Or the time my cousin tripped over a fence and broke his arm, and we had to carry him back in silence, pretending the injury had come from a bike accident the next day. The lies became second nature, woven into the fabric of who we were. What strikes me most now is how normalized it all felt. When other kids at school talked about summer camp or family vacations, I'd sit there wondering if I should share my own stories, about slipping through padlocked gates, about holding my breath as a police car rolled by, about carrying heavy crates on my small back while my heart hammered like a drum. Of course, I never did. Something in me knew our ritual wasn't something you bragged about to just anyone. It was a secret, and secrets have a way of sinking deep into your bones. To this day, whenever I smell old wood or rusting metal, it all comes rushing back. The fear, the thrill, the laughter of my cousins, and Grandpa's proud grin as we unloaded our haul like victorious soldiers returning from battle. And yet, for all the memories, there's a shadow that hangs over them. The awareness that what felt like family bonding was actually grooming us to break laws without remorse. That realization didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, year after year, until one night, everything nearly fell apart. It happened during the summer when I was 15. The year when my sense of invincibility began to clash with the growing awareness that what we were doing wasn't just some quirky family pastime, it was dangerous. By then, I was old enough to see the nervous looks in my parents' eyes when Grandpa gave the signal, the way they tried to mask hesitation with forced smiles. Still, they obeyed, as if the weight of tradition was too heavy to shake off. That year's target was different. Instead of the usual abandoned yards or neglected barns, Grandpa pointed to a spot on his so-called map that made my stomach churn, a hardware store on the edge of town, one that was still very much in business. The plan was to slip in through the back lot after closing and collect a pile of unused lumber stacked neatly by the dumpster. He spun it the way he always did, saying, "If they're throwing it out, it ain't stealing. We're just saving it from rot." But even I could see the flaw in that logic. Those stacks weren't trash. They were inventory. They were money. And sneaking onto the property wasn't just a game. It was trespassing into a place protected by cameras, alarms, and real consequences. My cousins whispered nervously, but no one dared challenge Grandpa. He had this way of framing everything as a test of loyalty, and if you hesitated, you weren't just letting him down. You were betraying the family. So we went. I remember the air that night, thick and heavy with humidity, cicadas buzzing so loudly it felt like the whole world was vibrating. My heart pounded in my throat as we crept along the side streets, flashlights tucked into our pockets, the adults whispering instructions like generals leading troops into battle. The hardware store loomed ahead, its sign dimly lit, the parking lot empty. It should have felt safe, but my gut screamed otherwise. We split into groups, lookouts, carriers, and gatherers, just like always. I was assigned as a carrier, my job to haul away whatever the gatherers tossed my way. My arms ached before we even started, because I knew lumber wasn't light. Grandpa, of course, stood at the center of it all, orchestrating the mission with that same reckless grin he always wore, like he was 30 years younger and immortal. We hopped the chain-link fence one by one, the metal clinking beneath our weight. I nearly froze when I heard the sound. It was so loud, too loud, like it echoed across the empty lot. But no alarms went off. No dogs barked. We moved in silence, shadows among shadows. The gatherers started stacking planks into our arms, and we shuffled back and forth like ants stealing crumbs. For a few minutes, it almost felt easy, almost routine, and I started to think maybe my fear was misplaced. And then it happened. A sudden flood of light exploded across the lot, blinding, white, merciless. Someone had flipped on the security floodlights. My chest tightened as if the air itself had turned to stone. "Run!" someone hissed, and in an instant, chaos erupted. My cousins scattered, dropping boards that clattered against the concrete. My aunt tripped, scraping her knees, while my uncle yanked her to her feet. Grandpa didn't move. He stood there, squinting at the light, as if daring whoever was behind it to come closer. But I couldn't wait. I bolted, my legs pumping so hard I thought they'd snap, the sound of my own breath deafening in my ears. Behind me, I heard shouting. Real voices, angry and sharp, cutting through the night. It wasn't just lights. Someone was there. We had been caught. My body shook with panic as I dove behind the fence, ripping my shirt on the wire, blood trickling down my arm. I didn't stop. None of us did. We sprinted through alleys, leapt over hedges, crawled through ditches until we finally collapsed in the woods behind Grandpa's house, gasping for air, sweat dripping down our backs. That night, we sat in silence, not laughing like we usually did, not celebrating. The thrill had soured, replaced by the bitter taste of fear. Grandpa, though, was unshaken. He spat into the dirt, lit a cigarette, and said, "We did what we had to do. They'll forget about it." But I couldn't. I couldn't forget the blinding light, the shouting voices, the feeling that this time we had pushed too far. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I began to hate the ritual. The weeks after that night felt different, as if a dark cloud hovered over the entire family. Normally, after one of our rituals, there would be laughter, secret smiles, exchanged at breakfast, and Grandpa's booming voice retelling the story as though we had won some legendary battle. But this time, no one spoke of it. The lumber, what little we had managed to drag back, sat stacked in the garage like a pile of evidence, silent and accusing. Every time I walked past it, my chest tightened. I couldn't shake the image of that floodlight exploding over us, or the voices shouting in the night, echoing with authority and anger. At school, I jumped whenever a door slammed, half expecting police officers to storm in and point me out. I stopped sleeping properly, my dreams, plagued by sirens and handcuffs and my grandfather's voice insisting it was all tradition. The other kids seemed shaken too. My cousin, who had always bragged the loudest, suddenly went quiet, avoiding eye contact. My aunt wore long sleeves to cover her scrapes and walked with her head down. Even my father, who had always stood so tall, beside Grandpa, started pacing at night, smoking cigarettes in the backyard while my mother watched him with worried eyes. But Grandpa? He acted like nothing had happened. He still polished his shoes every morning, still sipped his whiskey in the evenings, still told us stories of his youth as though he hadn't led us straight into the jaws of disaster. He called us cowards if we hesitated, said the world was weak and full of rules meant to be broken, and we were the only ones strong enough to keep the old ways alive. It should have inspired me, but instead it filled me with dread. I realized then that he wasn't keeping a tradition alive. He was keeping us chained to his own stubborn refusal to let go of the past. And then the knock came. It was a Saturday afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of cut grass, when 3 uniformed officers appeared at our front door. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I'd be sick. They asked to speak to my grandfather. My mother's hands trembled as she called him to the porch, and the rest of us pressed ourselves against the walls, straining to hear. The officers asked questions about a disturbance at the hardware store. They mentioned trespassing, property damage, and suspicious footprints leading away from the scene. My heart thudded so loudly I was sure they could hear it through the window. But Grandpa, with the calmness of a man who had lied his entire life, chuckled and shook his head. "Footprints? Officer, I've barely left this porch in weeks. Must have been some kids fooling around." His voice was steady, almost mocking. The officers didn't look convinced, but they couldn't prove anything. After a few more questions, they left, warning him to call if he saw anything unusual. Their car disappeared down the road. Relief washed over me like a wave, but it was tainted with something darker. Shame. Shame that I had been part of something that nearly destroyed us. Shame that I had once thought it was all just harmless fun, and shame that I still felt a twisted flicker of pride for having gotten away with it. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision. The ritual would end with me. I wouldn't pass it on to my children. I wouldn't laugh about it at family gatherings or frame it as some kind of charming quirk. It wasn't a quirk, it was a crime. And though the law hadn't caught up with us, the weight of it had already carved itself into my bones. Years later, When Grandpa passed away, we buried him with all the reverence you'd expect, neighbors speaking kindly of the old man with the strong spirit. No one mentioned the rituals. They were buried with him, a secret sealed in the ground. And yet, sometimes when summer nights grow thick with cicada song and the air smells of rust and grass, I feel the tug of memory. I remember the thrill, the fear, the way we believed we were carrying on something important. And I shiver, because I know that if anyone had caught us, if those officers had come one night sooner, we wouldn't have been a family with a strange tradition. We would have been a family torn apart by handcuffs and headlines. That's the thing about rituals. They may feel normal, even sacred when you're inside them. But step outside and you see the truth. And the truth about ours is simple. It could have gotten us all arrested.